Samuel Leigh arrived in Sydney, Australia, aboard the Hebe on the 10th of August 1815 and was the first Methodist missionary in the then colony of New South Wales. Wesley Mission celebrations of his arrival began back in 2012 with our Celebrate 200 event, beginning with street theatre in Martin Place, where we reenacted the initial meeting of Bowden, Hosking and Eager. We then marched down Pitt Street and on into the State Theatre for the culmination of our celebrations of 200 years of Methodism in Australia. On a recent trip to Britain, I travelled to Milton to find out more about Samuel Leigh's roots, and therefore the roots of our Wesley Mission and how the work began here in Australia. We're here at the Samuel Leigh Memorial Church in Milton in the Potteries of England. How many times have I been in buildings and churches and seen plaques? But here's a remarkable one, to the Rev Samuel Leigh. Underneath, a photograph of a very simple cottage where Samuel Leigh was born. Because one man, Samuel Leigh, knew what it was to respond to the call of God. Helen Schooner, it's good to talk to you because you have pastoral responsibility here at the church. How important is it for you to be able to keep history alive in terms of somebody like Samuel Leigh?
It's very important in the sense that we are here because Samuel Leigh left the money that we could have the original Leigh Memorial Church. I so much admire that this man was able to get on a boat not knowing where he was going, could be shipwrecked, there were storms, other ships in the convoy were lost. The commitment and the dedication and the faith of this man is something I really take my hat off to.
I don't think Samuel Leigh, to be honest, is particularly well known. One of our stewards was looking at a plaque in the church, the old church, one day and said, "Do you realise Samuel Leigh was born 200 years ago?" And I said, "Oh, we ought to write a book. I'll write a book."
As I understand it, he was down through the Methodist mission projects to go to Montreal. But that never happened, did it?
That never happened. It was thought to be too dangerous. So he went to Australia and eventually New Zealand.
When he arrived in Australia, it was a very, very tough context that he came into.
Oh, yes, convicts, etc., etc. Yes, it wasn't easy. He felt that God had called him to preach the gospel, and he felt that God's Holy Spirit was with him. And, he didn't give up.
Back in Australia, I then journeyed to 3 important sites in terms of the early days of Methodism in Australia. My first stop was Parramatta and the Leigh Memorial Church in Macquarie Street. This historic Gothic church was built in 1885, following the construction of 2 previous churches on the same site. The first was a sandstone chapel built in 1821, and that helps to give us a picture of the importance and significance of Samuel Leigh's ministry in Parramatta, but also its significance in the growing Wesleyan Methodist work. One of those questions that people ask when you come to Sydney, I suppose they're trying to trick you out, is where is the centre of Sydney? And actually, in many ways, in population, in terms of the city itself, Parramatta is actually that place. And Parramatta was very significant in those very early days when those 3 centres at Windsor, Parramatta, and of course at Castlereagh were important in the early development. And Samuel Leigh is remembered in the Leigh Memorial Church here in Parramatta, where the work has been advanced and continues also in a word and deed ministry. I then travelled out to Windsor, to another church that's also the 3rd building to stand up on this site. This land was originally donated by Samuel Marsden from his own farm in 1818, and Leigh himself watched the foundation stone of that original building being laid. Windsor became a most significant place, and for the early Methodists, a centre of mission and outreach. John Wesley in the 18th century had a strategy from 3 centres, from London, from Bristol and Newcastle upon Tyne. It's not surprising then that the first Wesleyans, and Samuel Leigh in particular, took a strategy seriously. So the first chapel was built at Castlereagh, here at Windsor, and of course in Sydney. And from that base, in a very different age, they reached out with the good news of Jesus Christ. My final stop was Castlereagh. This location holds a hugely important place in the history of Methodism in Australia. I'm currently here at Castlereagh, at the Wesleyan Chapel, the first Wesleyan Chapel site in Australia. Why am I here? Well, because this was an important part of the Samuel Leigh story. As he came on Old Traveller out here and the work began and flourished. And I'm going to be talking to Dick Udy, who has a special responsibility, enthusiasm, passion for this side. He's going to tell us something of that interesting story of how this remarkable man, under the influence and call of God, found himself here at Castlereagh. Now the story of Samuel Leigh it's a very interesting stage when we come here, because this is really the first Methodist chapel that was built, really, and on this side. And how does he come to be here in this area, and the link with John Lees?
Well, John Lees by this time was well known by the Wesleyan Society in town as being a great contributor to what was going on, and so Leigh felt that he had to come out and visit him.
And it was a remarkable visit, wasn't it? Because he knocks on the door of the house and pick up the story there.
Yes, well, after being rejected by one of the other settlers further away, to whom he'd been invited to go, he came down. Of course, he was rather tenuous about making any contact, so he knocked on the door, and out came a ruddy little boy who grabbed hold of his stirrup and said, "Get down, sir, my father will be so glad to see you." And when he went inside, father and other members of the family were gathered around having their evening devotions.
And they felt that God had somehow brought this all together. Now look, we're stood here now, and the first chapel, the original one, is where?
It's 2 odd miles away where Lees actually lived. It was part of the house.
Lees felt that he had to do something, didn't he?
Yes.
And so that's how we get to be here, isn't it?
Lees was already interested in the Wesleyan ministry. He felt that he really wanted to pull his weight in behind the Wesleyan missionaries, who were then well known.
So the second chapel was where?
The second chapel is right here where we're standing. Now, it was a very gaunt, straight, rectangular place with this large notice, "Prepare to meet thy God."
Like a preaching centre, as they would have called it in those days, wouldn't they?
Yes.
So Leigh, very much inspiring Lees. They moved on. They have the second church here, and then we moved to a third iteration, if you like, don't we?
Yes.
And that's this chapel.
This is this chapel here.
What date are we on with this one?
1847.
And is it? I mean, this is the feel I get anyway. That John Lees was almost waiting for somebody like Samuel Leigh to come along, almost like he stepped in at just the right time.
Absolutely, yes. When he was converted by the Reverend Cartwright in Windsor, he came back resolved to make his contribution to the community a very Christian awareness of God's dealings with people.
What do you see, in a nutshell, the purpose of this place now?
It is a historical point in our Methodist Church history, and it's also something that suggests, look, no matter how difficult the situation in life is, the presence of God will lead us through from disaster and problems to a sense of wholeness with Him.
Thank you, Dick Udy. Wesley Mission is very proud of its Methodist roots, and today has now perhaps surpassed even the most ambitious expectations of those early Wesleyans. Who could have envisaged the growth we've undergone from those humble beginnings? But following in the footsteps of those who've gone before, Wesley Mission proudly carries the flame ignited and passed on by our early pioneers as we boldly move forward into the future, doing all the good we can in the modern Australia, because each and every life matters.